It's panic stations at the BBC. They've held an emergency meeting to try to win the trust of Reform voters. 85% of Reform voters said they did not trust the BBC much or at all, according to a YouGov poll. Now, hey, I can't for the life of me imagine why that is.
And he has said that this is now a matter of national security.
Nigel Farage with his customary inflammatory language there at a Reform UK press conference. He declined to stand for a seat, but we will have more.
Oh, it's not very impartial. Here's the apology.
Now, an apology. Earlier today, we heard live from Nigel Farage speaking at that election event we just saw. And when we came away from his live speech, I used language to describe it, which didn't meet the BBC's editorial standards on impartiality. I'd like to apologise to Mr Farage and viewers for this.
OK, all right. Well, look, they always select totally unbiased studio audiences.
The following night in Birmingham, we have yet another Question Time special, much like tonight, but it will be with the Green Party co-leader Adrian Ramsey and Reform UK's leader Nigel Farage, and that will be on at 8 o'clock. So if you want to be all sort of interesting noises from the audience here.
And hey, it's not like their former flagship reporters are all closet rabid left-wingers, is it?
Think there is an appalling issue with grooming when it hits any community and any age. We only ever hear you talk about Pakistani perpetrators.
Are you telling me there's no issue?
I'm telling you that you are focusing on Pakistani grooming gangs because probably you're racist and you don't believe that there are white perpetrators of the same crime. Can you deny that?
Oh, look. That's just one example.
Well, my family don't have any assets, I'm afraid, Trevor, so there we go. And I don't expect them to have, and if they did, I wouldn't expect them to give it to me. I would rather, I grew up in a council house, as a matter of fact, yeah.
Well, then you own a lot of money because you buy the council houses and they're worth a lot more.
No, don't.
Yes.
My parents now live in private rented accommodation. The point is what I'm saying to you, right, is that you are exactly the problem here. You are saying, you're afraid so, Trevor. I'm afraid so.
OK, all right, look, fine. I mean, that's just two examples.
You look at the chaos going on the continent, particularly in France. You look at the chaos likely ahead in the United States. And suddenly, for once, for the first time in many of our lives, actually Britain looks like a little haven of peace and stability. And that in itself is going to draw money into this country.
OK, it's just three examples.
But the Israeli position is that what is happening in Gaza is a response to the slaughter and capture of innocent Israelis on October the 7th. And
which was awful, which was truly awful.
And that full context needs to be there when discussing what's going on.
But that's not the full context, is it? Because the full context starts way before October the 7th, doesn't it?
Yeah, maybe there is a bit of a pattern going on, actually. But, hey, it's not like Reform voters are sick of the BBC ramming needless diversity down their throats. I mean, maybe Isaac Newton was black. Please let me your ears for this news I shall impart. May not have been told, we have been here from the start. Maybe the Romans were black as well. OK, obviously it's not like they've just done positive PR for the burqa or anything.
OK, are you being forced to wear that? Are you?
I think that's a common question.
Yeah. And I like curiosity, that's a nice thing, but the element of ignorance just really winds me up.
OK. Well, at least Reform voters can't accuse the Beeb of pushing gender ideology onto kids.
Meep. Yes, the Meep. I promise I can help him get home and then you'll never see me again.
You're assuming he as a pronoun.
True. Yes, sorry, good point. Are you he or she or they?
My chosen pronoun is the definite article. I am always the Meep.
Oh, I do that.
Maybe now I think about it, maybe the BBC should just give up trying to appeal to Reform voters. I think the damage has probably been done. Let's get thoughts from our panel. We have got GB News star Alex Armstrong, columnist and broadcaster Esther Kraku, and journalist Jonathan Liss. Alex, look, I mean,
Do you think the BBC will ever be able to appeal to Reform voters, realistically?
No. I mean, every time I speak to a Reform voter or see them online, they absolutely despise everything the BBC stands for. Now, that litany of things you just showed us, that's probably the tip of the iceberg, Patrick. And at the end of the day, trust in mainstream media is at an all-time low. People are looking to other sources of information to get their news. This has happened across America as well because the bias is so strong. And the worst part about it is it tries to disguise itself as a non-biased institution, and we can all clearly see that it's got an agenda. I don't think they're going to win Reform voters back, no matter how hard they try, at least in the short term.
Yeah, I mean, Esther, they expect us to all be shocked when someone who used to work at the BBC comes out and starts doing a podcast or something, and then they reveal themselves to be a whopping great big lefty.
Yeah, I think the use of the term reform voter is quite strategic here. I think what they actually mean is anti-establishment viewers. But it's easy to pigeonhole that as reform voters because then you conveniently ignore people under the age of 30 who are also completely ignoring the BBC on virtually every platform. The BBC doesn't have a problem with just reform voters. They have a problem with people that don't see why they should be paying a licence fee, that are not necessarily of the age group that will probably be home benefiting from it. Young people, people that think that some of the mistakes that the BBC have made are unforgivable, like not calling Hamas a UK-designated terrorist group, a terrorist group, and all of that. Now, some people think, actually, the principle of something like the BBC is still worth fighting for, but you're having a hard time making that case when we live in a world where you can get streaming platforms for £10 with much more, actual choice, and you don't have certain kinds of things being rammed down your throat. You can actually trust a lot more of the stuff that's coming out there, or at the very least, it's entertainment. So you don't have to check all the boxes of whether it's being factual. So that's the problem. The problem that the BBC has is much bigger than reform voters.
Yeah, I mean, look, the BBC can have as many emergency meetings as it wants, Jonathan. But at the end of the day, the people in those emergency meetings are either whopping great big lefties or part of the metropolitan elite, and they're just not in touch, are they?
It's just not true. I mean, look at some of the BBC star presenters from the last 2 decades. Jeremy Paxman, Conservative. John Humphreys, massive Conservative Brexiter. Andrew Neil, for goodness sake, formerly of this parish, it's a raving right-wing person, or whatever, call him left-wing. But it's not the point. The BBC. Well, I'll tell you who is still there. The current Secretary General, Director General rather, of the BBC. He was once a Conservative candidate for public office. I mean, this is the idea that the BBC is overrun by lefties. It's just not. It's just not true. It's not true.
Exactly what I was about to say. Just because you were a Conservative Party member doesn't mean.
Well, then you can't change the goalposts. He's clearly not a lefty, is he? He's not a lefty. For heaven's sake, Alex, he's not a left-winger, is he? He's a Tory. You can say whatever you like about the Tories.
He's not a reform voter, is he? And that's the point. Well, I mean, and that's what they're trying to get at.
You look at. I'll tell you who is a bit of a reform voter, Nigel Farage, who's been on Question Time more than anybody else living. So the idea the BBC ignores reform voters or reform issues is just not true.
I will say this though. I think another place that the BBC have dropped the ball is really local issues. So this is another reason why it kind of looks like the haven of the detached metropolitan elite, because local radio and all of these things that were usually a lot of young people's way into media anyway, in journalism, has fallen by the wayside. The BBC actually used to be a British broadcasting channel. It actually used to represent. Well, exactly. It used to represent the whole of Britain. But if you look at not only the people that are making editorial choices at the BBC, but also the people that are headlining it, they literally just look like part of the M25 elite.
I think one of the big problems that they've got, and what this survey literally found, was that people don't trust the BBC to tell them the truth on things anymore. That is a massive problem. Whenever you have some kind of big attack or whenever you have some kind of major incident, there is a sense, now the BBC will probably deny that this is the case, they may well vehemently defend themselves here, fair enough. But I'm telling you that I think there is a perception that they are constantly trying to cover things up, especially when it comes to not wanting to stoke racial tension.
That's certainly the truth. And because the BBC is basically owned by the government, so to speak, I mean, that's well, they are. They're taxpayer funded, basically. You might as well call them taxpayer funded. I know they're not, but you might as well call it that way. And at the end of the day, as you saw, all of those presenters there who are now running their own podcasts or doing whatever else, a litany of liberal North Islington elite. That's what they are. They hold. They do. You're bloody one of them.
I think the BBC's biggest issue was the entertainment side of things. So if you notice that at Cannes Film Festival, the BBC is selling off all their licenses for lots of their own creative work, mainly because there hasn't really been a hit. And so there was a big question of whether the BBC should focus on news and factual stuff as opposed to entertainment. You can do entertainment because obviously that's a way to connect with broader audiences, particularly younger audiences. But again, who are the people heading up these creative rooms? They're not exactly.
But it's an important point though, because the BBC. I'm not sure that you're correct when you say the BBC is not trusted. When you have a major world event, a breaking news event, people are turning onto the BBC. When you have a major sports event, people are tuning into the BBC, whether it's World Cup.
Well, it's normally because they're showing it, right? and they have a lot of resources
when push comes to shove, the nation rallies around the BBC. You have it at major world events. It's true, you know, you have when you have big events, the Queen dying, whatever, and also you still have those reform voters that you were talking about before. I guarantee you that many of those are still watching, you know, EastEnders, Doctor Who, Strictly, all of the big shows the BBC does so well.
Really interesting point that you've made there, because I think that now what people are doing is they're waking up to what I would regard as being needless, performative, virtue signalling diversity on things like EastEnders, on things on Strictly, on things like all of these different shows. I mean, the Call the Midwife, for example, once. I remember watching that, under pain of death a few Christmases ago, and they did the Christmas special, and there was an anti-Brexit joke in there. It was called The Midwife, and it was set in the flipping 20s, for goodness sake. And there's the crowbarring. People are now having their eyes open to this crowbarring of things in there, I think.
Well, but that's the issue. If you're going to make something to do with entertainment and creativity, you really have to look at the people that are writing the scripts. And unfortunately, the kinds of people that are even making it into these rooms are not really representative of Britain. And even more so, they're not the kinds of people whose idea of entertainment really reflects much of the country. And that's because of the kinds of the funnels through which people are recruited. You have to basically either live in London or Manchester. You have to basically have rich parents. You have to basically be like au fait with the new woke issue of the day. It's not really like, you know, your white working class boy from Scarborough.
Maybe 30 years ago that was the case.
No, but that's true. Have you tried getting an internship at the BBC? It used to be a lot easier.
But even if you look at the roster of presenters, where do you hear a northern voice? Where do you hear a voice that sounds even remotely?
Well, they literally moved their headquarters up to Salford.
And now what did that do? They just took all the liberal elites from London and just moved them to Manchester.
Look, I'm not saying the BBC doesn't have any problems with diversity. I mean, it's ironic that we're talking about a lack of diversity when I sort of normally get complaints. There's too much diversity in Britain.
Well, the right kind of diversity.
Right, the right kind of diversity, of course, the right kind of diversity. So, look, the BBC has obviously problems, but I think it's an institution worth fighting for, worth keeping.
There's a difference between diversity of thought.
Can I just ask as well, when it comes to a purely news sense, I really think they've been seriously undermined in the last few years by the people that have left and gone on to do different things. So Andrew Marr has come up with a couple of comments. We heard one there where he was basically praising this Labour government as creating a bastion of stability in Europe that would bring revenue in. Well, the unemployment figures have landed. They're not pretty reading, and Rachel Reeves is about to give a financial statement. There is a story, by the way, which we're going to be talking about later, and it appears that the money that we're giving to the Chagos Islands, Mauritius, for the Chagos Islands, Mauritius is going to use to give its own citizens a tax break and bring down their national debt. So that is how absolutely on the ball Andrew Marr was there. The second Emily Maitlis leads, you've got, referring to Rupert Lowe as a racist, daring to speak about Pakistani grooming gangs. I mean, Lewis Goodall there was essentially saying stuff that was borderline Marxist on his LBC show. It absolutely was.
That's not true.
And now it gives that perception that these are the people that were reporting on major news events throughout Brexit, for example, at the BBC. And does it not just reveal what their own internal biases were when they were telling us that they were impartial?
Not necessarily. You have to have balance. I don't have a problem with Emily Maitlis having the kind of politics she does. I think the problem that the BBC has is balance. And it's usually, if you actually take off the veneer of the actual presenters, it's the people making the editorial decisions in the back. That's when you're seeing actually a lack of real true diversity of thought. And it's a struggle, right? If you don't want to seem of too left or too right, you have to get that balance right. And that comes from the editorial decision.
But also the way that they weren't doing it. And that's why trust in the BBC is so low. And that's why people don't believe it when they watch it now. And I think you're right, but also it's the interpretation of the person reading that defines whether or not...
OK, but you always have a problem, Alex, because, Emily Maitlis herself made this point. I mean, obviously, no one's claiming that Emily Maitlis is a right-wing Brexiter, but she did make the point that during the Brexit debate, and obviously that was a totemic time, that you would have someone who actually knew quite a lot about their field, an economist, and you might have 50 economists believing one thing and one economist believing the other thing, but you had to present this idea of
Equal,
balance.
but yeah.
So you had one and one. And
Yeah.
actually, you might have whatever view you like of Brexit, but that's
It's a line
not
of
accurately
question. Look, it's a line of
representing the
question.
view of
I'm
expertise.
sorry, but Emily Melis is also, and it wasn't a clip that I included there. I mean, the snarling behaviour that she exhibited when President Trump was being elected and towards Boris Johnson.
That's
but these are all
that's
things
to a personal
that,
discredit. Like, but I do agree with Jonathan. I think the BBC is worth saving, but I do think it has a lot of difficult decisions to make.
All right, OK. So a BBC spokesperson said, our Royal Charter requires us to reflect and represent all the communities of the UK, and our editorial guidelines require that we must take account of the different political parties with electoral support across the UK to achieve due impartiality. Well, there we go. Right, OK.